Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
I just would like to remind everyone, our children are watching us. It's really rather interesting. We keep referencing a generation of children that I would say are on their own page, although I have a sneaky suspicion that when I was that demographic in my teens and 20s and 30s, the older generations looked at us and said, what are these guys thinking of doing? We're all a byproduct of that particular era. I have developed this habit of asking people randomly, regardless of their political affiliations or any of the other dynamics like ethnicity, religion, culture, lifestyle. Do you trust the government? Resounding no. Do you trust the media? Resounding no. So let me put this in context for you in regards to our children. They're seeing and listening to the same things we are. And as you can imagine, they're probably scratching their heads wondering, what kind of country is this that I'm living in? So if you wonder why they're kind of off doing their own things and they're in a major disconnect from us, understand what they're witnessing. They're watching us and they're listening to us, which is why I go back at the media with their lack of reverence towards one another, the lack of decency, this inappropriate ridicule, demeaning, fixes nothing. I remind you, this show is not about contention. I'm not trying to convince you to vote for a particular party. I really am not attached to any of the above. I'm attached to this country in a general sense and to my children and the future of these children. So, when you listen, just understand we have an open mind here. We have our points of view. Many of them are based in research. So when I say certain things to you, I would encourage you to go out and investigate. I'm not trying to give you anything other than something to think about, some food for thought. It's really the direction we're going. I talked to you redundantly about the borders. Not much to say about the borders. You merely have to speak with some of the Democrat elected officials like mayors and congressmen and councilmen and even governors. They're all having a problem with this agenda at the border. Oddly enough, if you look at Oregon, half the state geographically is trying to secede to go to Idaho. Guys, the cuckoo, as I tell you all the time, has left the clock, and we can fix these problems, which is the purpose of this show. We're not here to pander, pat anybody on the head, and tell them that their agenda is correct when it's not. But we are interested in hearing from people that are not like-minded. We want to start to have a dialogue and reintroduce these concepts of decency and civility, all of which has left the conversation, So there's a lot of hot topics today. One in particular, ironically, was brought up by one of the gentlemen who is the co-owner of the organization that this podcast is being managed, supervised, and structured by, Brian Williams. Brian started to speak about this East Palestine, Ohio train derailment, 50 trains, way before the media did. It was only last night for the first time that it popped up in the media. And I kind of surfed the media outlets, and ironically, Fox gave it the most coverage. We spoke about this in depth off air because it's of grave concern. What is most alarming at this point is the fact that they're attempting to encourage the residents of this community to reintroduce themselves into the community, and they're interviewing these people, and they're complaining about a lot of manifestations of symptoms that are associated to a toxic environment. Curious to know that whether or not our government is affording the residents there, approximately 5,000 I understand, the same consideration that they are to people who have illegally crossed our border. In other words, are they providing them housing at no expense, food, education, medicine? I'd be curious to know if they're doing that, what FEMA's role is. I don't know if there's anything too nefarious attached to this because it doesn't necessarily serve the government purpose to cover this up because it's a lot hard to cover this up. Maybe they're just trying to not instill panic, but there are some grave concerns there. It'd be wonderful if we could deviate from this normal day of business where we intentionally withhold information from one another. The government's gotten into this habit of doing this on a regular basis. I'm about to go off on this discussion about balloons and unidentified objects, that they seem to think we shouldn't know anything about. You certainly should. This is your country. You're entitled to know when your country's in peril. Again, we don't want to panic you, but I don't think there's a downside to being prepared if that is necessary. But going back to this train derailment, this is quite an interesting discussion because, my thing is to learn from this and go forward. But if you're transporting these toxic chemicals, why isn't there redundancy in managing them safely? Everything has redundancy. The private security sector and the governmental security sector, we do through redundancy, through layering, right? Everything is done redundantly. How come there isn't technology employed or mechanisms, devices, whatever, to ensure the fact that if, God forbid, a train derails, and these are not anomalies, that we don't have an incident like this? So did you not want to spend the money to properly containerize some of these chemicals, number one? Number two, maybe we should consider not transporting them through very densely populated areas. Kind of the same way we have concerns about the positioning of nuclear reactors. California is concerned, for example, because it's geologically unsound. Questions to be asked and answered, and lessons to be learned. And my inclination is to not try to litigate this because I know there's going to be lawsuits coming out the wazoo here, but to learn from this and go forward with this. We're also having discussions today about this pipeline, Nord Stream, that was blown up, that the president and I believe the undersecretary of defense alluded to the fact that it would not be permitted to go forward. Suddenly we find out it got blown up. The finger does point in our direction. Doesn't mean we did it, but it certainly gives people to think we may have, consider it. It would be an international act of terrorism as outlined by my friend, colleague, Tom Fuentes, a former assistant director of the FBI, who has a lot of insight into this. We have so many topics to cover. I wanted to bring Tom back on today to address this balloon issue, sudden shooting down of objects that they say we're not quite sure what they are. I'm struggling to understand how you shoot down an object without clearly identifying what the object is or its intent. Now, with that being said, it was in airspace that could interfere with commercial airliners. That's a good enough reason. I'm sure they attempted to communicate with it, logically, and then employ technology to detect any kind of signal that might be emitted. Yes, I'm sure they're doing their homework. But all of a sudden we have this phenomenon. And we're, as a result of Nord Stream and this treaty we have with Canada, we sent one of our planes, an F-22 Raptor, to shoot down whatever was shot down in Canada. We're living in interesting times. It's not so bad that the times are interesting. What's really terrible is the fact that the government has taken on a posture of not being compelled to disclose information that we're all entitled to as citizens here. And for that matter, individuals who aren't citizens here. If you're visiting, might want to know what's going on in this place that you're visiting. We're going to have a guest on again today, Nick Lewin. Nick is a rather brilliant young man. He's very, very well accomplished. I'll go over this a few times with you, but he's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. If you know universities, probably one of the top two universities in our country, that and MIT. He is one of the co-founders of Crown Predator Investments. He's the director of Halo Maritime Defense Systems, which is really very interesting. You should look this up, Halo Maritime Defense Systems. It'll tell you a little bit about what that technology does, and in particular how it protects our ports when you employ it. So Nick is going to be on with us in not too distant future. And there's just, it's getting to the point in this country where there's so much that we need to be concerned about that it just kind of clogs your brain. I do want to speak about this Hunter Biden laptop. I don't understand in simplistic terms why there's this reluctance to just disclose in totality, absent of his personal life, his little exploits with women and drugs, because nobody cares about that. That's your private life. All the information's contained therein that might lend itself to some type of, I would say, compromising relationship with the Ukraine, China, and Russia. We're entitled to know. What we have right now is a massive game of politics. We have this propensity in this country to weaponize things politically, like we did with the virus back in March of 2020. Instead of saying, let's put our differences aside, collaborate, take care of the American public. We politicized the virus. We weaponized it. We do have certain individuals on the other side of the aisle that are attempting to weaponize this laptop. This is a very simple discussion. Disclose all the contents therein, absent of his personal life, and let the American public, who are entitled to know, understand what went on with him. There are already some inconsistencies in the president's story, being, for example, contradicted by this young man Bobolinsky, who everybody discounted a year or so ago, but suddenly he's on the mainstream of this conversation again. Let us know what happened there. It's very simple. In regards to Twitter and what took place with the FBI, it's just shameful because, we're getting to the point where we are systematically destroying every institution in this country that we need to believe in. The FBI was always that break point for us. Even in law enforcement, we knew when all else failed, you go to the FBI, their standards weren't compromising. We now know firsthand, this is not speculation, conjecture, opinion. Peter Strzok, Lisa Page exchanged some rather interesting text messages. I spoke about it. Tom Fuente spoke about it. Tom is the former assistant director of the FBI. He's just appalled. We have 24 or 27 whistleblowers from the FBI. I'm certain there are more lined up. Some just figured, these guys, they've got it. The first 24 probably have it. It's disheartening because we're entitled to something better than this. More importantly, our children are entitled to something better than this. At some point in time, the bow is going to break in this country. I know people don't believe that, but trust me, it's coming. What's really distressing is the fact that there's a minuscule, an infinitesimal percentage of this population that's steering this nation today. This is not the masses or anything even close. This is a minuscule percentage of the population. The masses of the population are distracted by things like taking care of their children, educating them, clothing them, feeding them, getting them proper medical care. Lots of discussions. You guys know we had another shooting, Michigan State, another individual with a mental health issue, no question, killed 3 people, I understand, and wounded 5 others. I am certain we're going to hear about gun control. Do not be drawn into the gun control discussion. We do need a different approach to people acquiring firearms, especially these high-capacity semi-automatic pistols and assault rifles, should you feel need to have one, kind of like the people in the Ukraine. But with that being said, the common denominator, once again, mental health, and if you look deep enough into the background, you'll see they're probably disenfranchised from their families. Might be a failed parenting issue going on here as well. But let us not tell the truth to anyone. We just, we need to get a voice of reason and calm, one that can galvanize the country. It's what's absent in the discussion today. All we're doing is being driven by politics and agenda, and it's at the expense of this nation as a whole, and in particular our young people. I'm going to say it until people connect the dots. I wish you loved your children as much as you love your politics and your agenda. We could go topic to topic, ladies and gentlemen. The tragic part of this discussion is the border is a fixable issue. The gun control issue is a fixable issue. The mental health issue is a fixable issue. The homeless population is fixable. All you have to do is ask the 5 million plus migrants who are illegal in the country that we're, creating housing, medicine, food, education for, and clothing them, I might note. Just look at the little skips that they're wearing as they're hopping around New York City protesting being moved to a facility in Brooklyn. They want to stay in a nice hotel that they have pictures of them trashing. I'm not anti-immigrant either. By the way, folks, we built the country on migrants. There's a process that you need to employ. I suggest you look up Edward Herman. He's an immigration lawyer. He can tell you how to facilitate a proper migration process where we bring people into the country. They become part of the workforce. They contribute to the country overall through paying Social Security and taxes, and then through additional process, they become citizens one day. Not that we do the 11 million plus, going to give them amnesty, Mr. Schumer, and hope that they vote in our direction, because that's what a lot of people suspect this whole thing is about. Okay, guys, going to take a quick break and come right back. We're going to have Nick Lewin. This is going to be an interesting conversation. Nick's a financial wizard. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Instacart. Another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application, without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and we have with us today Nick Lewin. He's the Chief Investment Officer and one of the founding partners of CYRPTO Holdings. He's got about 15-plus years in the private investment, public, and private markets. He happens to be the director of Halo Maritime Defense Systems, which I encourage you to look into a little bit. You'll find it rather interesting. It lends itself to our ability to protect our ports from attack, which is highly relevant today. As you know, for example, we have military installations, naval bases all around the country, Virginia for one, Southern California, another one. But Nick is also the driving force in a very large sense behind this podcast. He's been a major help in helping us keep this thing alive and trying to change the course and the conversation in this country. So I welcome you, Nick. I thank you for joining us. I thank you for your friendship, your unconditional support. But I want to ask you a question right out of the gate, Nick. Should we be investing in balloons? That's why I wanted you on screen so I could see you laugh, big guy. But are we investing in balloons now?
I assume that this has been going on for a long time, and now that it's made the news politically, they've decided they have to shoot them down. I assume that. I mean, I can't imagine that all of a sudden there are all these balloons floating from China and Russia towards us. But
I think we have our share of surveillance equipment in the sky as well. I think every nation that has any type of technological advancement is employing the same tactics to keep track of each other. In our instance, I know friends that we have in the agency and the FBI. We do this from outer space with satellites. We can see the part in your hair. The whole thing about the balloon, it's just insulting that a country that's an adversary of ours, China, would ever assume that they could fly an object like that over the landmass of this country without some type of consequence, more than just shooting the damn thing down. But as we all know, Nick, and I know that you live in this world, we can't buy a flashlight or a battery without it coming from China. We can't seem to get our cars, properly completed before you consume one of them without going to China.
There is an old school line, which I believe is never confuse incompetence for stupidity. So, it's tough for me to imagine that this was all that well thought out. I will tell you that in terms of China, the two most important things, as far as I'm concerned, if COVID's taught us anything, is you have to bring the supply chain home in terms of pharmaceuticals. You just can't be single-threaded with China, and you're seeing that happen. You're going to see kind of you're going to see a lot of that stuff go to Mexico. Like, if it were actually me, and I'm actually not joking at all, probably investing in Mexican manufacturing is going to be a big deal over the next 20 years.
But let me ask you this, if I may, Nick. So we won't get our pharmaceuticals from China. Is it that much better if we get them from Mexico in light of the corruption and cartel activity? And
it really just depends on how much you want to spend for your pharmaceuticals. So would it be clearly better if you made them in Arizona? Yeah, of course it would. I think, are we that worried about, producing stuff in Mexico versus the U.S.? Like, probably not. Could you sort out the same issue by having a coherent immigration policy? Probably. But I think if I had to bet, most of that's going to Mexico, and I'm sure there's some other places that'll crop up too. If you look at Costa Rica is now making a decent percentage of the world's medical devices. And so I think that's probably, that is one vertical that's all coming, probably not home, but near home. And then the other thing that should come home, which is happening, is slowly, is semiconductors. Like, if you assume that at some point China's going into Taiwan, you want to look at the delay that we've had in kind of cars what's happened to the car markets because of semiconductors, all that, you can't be single threaded there. So all that, if I had to bet, is coming back to America.
Nick, let me ask you this. Isn't Taiwan currently trying to build a factory in Arizona for these semiconductors?
They are building a factory in Arizona. They just need, they need 50 more of them.
Yeah, goes without saying. Nick, I want to ask you, if I may, about this cryptocurrency. What's your take on that?
I think it's a joke.
Do you think it has the ability to replace our currency?
There is zero chance. I think the federal government shouldn't have let it go this far. But, fundamentally, and I might have said this on the last podcast, at the end of the day, the U.S. Constitution doesn't give a lot of rights to the federal government. And I think probably one of the great mistakes of the past, 200 years is that we keep on taking power away from the states and giving it to the federal government. But one of the rights that the federal government has is the right to mint coin or run the kind of currency. And the idea that that's where the U.S. government essentially gets its powers, from the right to mint coin and really in detail print $100 bills, which is the mechanism for exchange around the world. And so I would go with, I am unaware of a use case for Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency that doesn't essentially border or cross the lines of legality. It's really good for evading currency controls. It's good for theoretically running transactions where you don't want to be traced. I'm not aware of a use case for Bitcoin that is anything other than things that are illegal. It's essentially, now enough people believe in Bitcoin specifically and maybe Ethereum that it's become essentially some version of digital gold, right? Gold doesn't have any intrinsic value. I think there's a statistic that you can take all the gold that's ever been mined in the world and it wouldn't fit in an Olympic swimming pool. It's much less than you think it is, but people believe in it. So it's got, a monetary value. The only difference is obviously gold can get turned into watches and necklaces and jewelry, and Bitcoin doesn't get turned into anything. But for me, at some point, the federal government will shut it down, or essentially they'll just regulate it into obliteration.
You think the government will shut it down? Is that what you're saying?
I think they'll regulate it into the point where it doesn't have any use. Now, the technology behind Bitcoin is supposedly interesting, the blockchain technology. But I would go with, if you think about Europe, right? The U.S. is different, right? The U.S. gets its power from being the reserve currency of the world. If you think about Europe, what's interesting about Europe, right, is you look at the tax dynamics that they have, and everybody makes this analogy of, you've got too many people in the cart and not enough people pulling the cart. And what's interesting is look at like Greece, for example. You know how many official swimming pools there are in Greece? About 100. You know how many swimming pools are actually in Greece? Probably 1 million. And the reason is that they have a tax on swimming pools. Or look at the unemployment rate in Spain, right? The official unemployment rate in Spain is something like 35%. The actual unemployment rate in Spain is about 9%, because 25% of their workforce is getting paid under the books and not paying taxes. They don't have a tax-based problem. They have a tax collection problem. If you go to Italy, they keep 3 sets of books: the actual books, the books they show the tax man, and the books of the business they do with the Russians. And so if you look at all that, right, once you go to a digital currency, you eliminate all tax fraud. Essentially, who's a swimming pool maintenance guy. You know who makes swimming pools. You can see who pays him. You can make sure you get paid your taxes. If you don't get paid in a digital euro in Spain, you're not going to get paid, because you got to have the money in the system. And so the thing about a digital currency is that it eliminates tax fraud, which is critical in Europe. Now, by the way, there's obviously kind of what I would call the Southern Euro, Spain, Italy, some other countries, Greece, and you've got kind of a Northern Euro, which probably involves Germany. But functionally, that ends all problems. And then there's probably a real debate about do you want to have, take it back to the US, do you want the US to move to a digital currency? And do you want them to have that kind of insight into what you're spending, right? And the truth of the matter is that people already have that insight. They're just the credit card companies, right? The credit card companies know everything about everybody. And so the question is, do you want the federal government to have that kind of insight as well? And then that's the question about whether or not the U.S. ever moves to a digital U.S. dollar, which I suppose may happen, but I would think is a very long time off.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to the byproduct of an education at Johns Hopkins University, where Nick attended, I reminded you earlier, and his experience in this financial market. You can see he has a tremendous amount of insight and understanding. And I hope the listeners were paying attention, because there's a lot of very good, relevant information about what's going on in crypto. And I want to ask you this. Gold and silver, they push these, Nick. Are these something that we should have in a portfolio, in your opinion?
I don't know. The problem with gold and silver is, the tax rate on commodities is terrible, right? Because the U.S. government doesn't want you owning it.
Why is that, Nick? Why don't they want us owning it?
Because they want you owning the U.S. dollar. So the tax rate, there's no long-term capital gains for commodities. I think everything's at the federal tax rate. And so if you want to buy gold and silver and never sell it, right, that's not, I suppose that's a reasonable thesis. And there's obviously a world of like gold coins and silver coins that I'm just not familiar with. But functionally, the issue is, or the way I would pose it is, do you want to own gold and silver with a terrible tax rate? Or would you rather own Walmart stock or Amazon stock? And the reason I say that is, if Walmart goes bankrupt, you don't need gold coins. You need a gun. Same thing with Amazon. And so, the reason you buy gold and silver in theory is that it's a hedge against inflation, because they're same for Bitcoin, right? They're only making there's only so much of it. But the thing is, if like when Walmart goes bankrupt, like the U.S. dollar has collapsed, and at that point, you need other things. And so I would go with, if the reason you buy gold is because you don't believe in the U.S. dollar, why not buy a Walmart or a Chevron that pays a dividend that theoretically is going to increase in value, and have a better tax rate?
Nick, we're going to take a quick break, my friend, and we're going to come right back to you. I want to continue this conversation. I want to ask you about the overall economy, your perception. We just had an interesting jobs report, 500,000 plus, a low unemployment rate, which I think is attached to the fact that people have just withdrawn from the employment game. But we're going to take a quick break, and I'm right back to you guys. Stick with us. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and we have Nick Lewin again. We had him on before. An immense amount of insight and understanding into currency, commodities, investments, where to put your money in a sense. And interestingly enough, our producer on the show, Lloyd Molander, who's a law school graduate in California, avid surfer. I won't talk to you about what he asked me about the kind of love I was getting today. It was strange, was attached to it. That's a different discussion. He has a question for Nick. And Nick, can you give us this question, Lloyd, please?
Sure, Nick. Thanks for being on. For the viewers that may ask this question, is not cash the most corruptible, laundered currency type? And a lot of people ask, what is the full faith and credit of the U.S. government? And do we have that as consumers?
So on the first one, yeah, I mean, look, the $100 bill is what is used around the world. I mean, they use $100 bills in Russia, I think, religiously. You can pay for anything around the world, and I traditionally do in $100 bills. I don't even bother changing into local currencies at this point. I just use U.S. dollars and hope that they'll figure it out. I think the thing is that if you've ever seen $1 million in U.S. $100 bills, like that's a fairly sizable and weight it weighs a bunch. And so unless you're Pablo Escobar, right, who supposedly was just, piling the stuff, other than governments, I think probably this stuff is used on a micro level that doesn't really matter. The thing about Bitcoin, right, is that you can move money in size. And I think the federal government probably cares about that a lot more. They're probably not worried about somebody not paying taxes on, nannies or whatever in $100 bills. They probably are worried about, terrorist financing, North Korea financing. I mean, I think, and I haven't looked recently, but if you go look at it, one of the largest forgers of U.S. currency is North Korea, right? And that is, ultimately traceable, manageable, that kind of stuff. But you give them access to something like Bitcoin, where they can really move large amounts of money around. They figure that out. That's probably a bigger concern. We put sanctions on Iran or Russia or whoever. Managing to track the way they're evading sanctions using currencies, which cryptocurrencies, in size is probably a much bigger concern. And then, look, the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. I mean, at the end of the day, right? Like, if you think about what the U.S. government tax rates are, it's effectively like they own, it's essentially like the U.S. has 30 or 40% of the entire U.S. economy, right? Because they get 30 to 40 cents of every dollar that comes out. That's essentially what the full faith and credit of the U.S. government is. They keep spending this way. Are they eventually going to have a problem? Like, sure, of course they are, but not for the foreseeable future.
Nick, I want to ask you a question about this is kind of simplistic question. What's your perception of the economy today? What are your feelings? Like, we hear a lot out of D.C., depending on the source, Republicans or Democrat, it gives us a different spin, so to speak. We just heard about 500,000 jobs that were created, which is a good indicator. But what's really going on here as far as job creation, the overall economy, and this unemployment discussion, which they claim is so low that I think many of us realize it's the byproduct of people just withdrawing from the job market. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think fundamentally, inflation is going to be very tough to get a hold of. I think you have to remember that the U.S. government it's like IQ, okay? Like when you hear somebody's IQ test results, like it's not measuring its intelligence, it's measuring IQ, right? And it's not the same thing. And similarly, the U.S. government reported jobs numbers or inflation numbers, they're all manufactured, right? It's the U.S. government version of those numbers. They're probably directionally correct, but they're very manufactured. But I think people generally know the truth because they see it in their pocketbooks, right? The U.S. government can tell you inflation is whatever they say it is, 6.5%. You know what a carton of eggs now costs, and it's up way more than 6.5%. I think the economy, I think, is probably still doing okay, but it's a function of how much money they printed. So if you go back to classes that I did not attend at Johns Hopkins University, they teach you about the money supply. And the thing is that a dollar, when the federal government prints a dollar, it's not actually worth a dollar. It's worth 7 times that. Because what happens is a dollar goes into the system and the bank lends it out. And then when somebody comes and redeposits in the bank has a reserve requirement. So they get to lend 20% of that amount out. So that dollar comes back, and now it's not a dollar because the dollar's gone out. It's gone back into the bank lends it back out. Now that dollar's worth $1.80. Then it eventually comes back to the bank, and the bank lends it out again, and now it's not worth $1.80. It's worth $2.44 because they were able to lend out 64 cents. And then they're able to lend out, 48 cents. And so I think it's the math is something like a dollar ends up $1 printed by the federal government means $7 in circulation as it flows in and out of the banks. The issue, right, is that what the federal government is doing when they raise rates is they're deleveraging the economy, because so people borrow less money because the rates are no longer 2%, they're 6%, which means the speed of money is slowing up, right? That dollar's not worth $7. It's worth, the dollar printed isn't, because it's not traded 7 times, it's traded 5 times, something like that. And so the problem is that they can keep delevering the economy all they want by raising rates. The problem is they still printed 5 or 6 or 7 trillion dollars during COVID, and that's still sloshing around. And so, there's all this unused money that the federal government appropriated. And I think one of the big fights is shutting that down versus keep going. If you look, there's a program out there right now called the ERC credits. It's the old version of PPP, and they're still giving out money for free. And they should stop, because when you do that, you're essentially creating a short-term boom, right, in economic activity for a long-term disaster. So, you have people still out. Like if you go look at the biggest luxury company in the world, Louis Vuitton, they're crushing it. And they're crushing it because people still have this extra money and they're spending it on kind of discretionary items. Eventually that ends. And eventually what happens is you have to get the people who've left the job market. The participation rate matters far more than the unemployment rate. You have to get those people to come back to work. And how do you get those people to come back to work? You have to have them, be worried about not being able to pay their mortgage. And that happens when you keep raising rates. And by the way, most people, I think, took out 7 or 10-year interest-free ARMs that were fixed at 2% or 3% money, and that must have happened in 2020. And so all those people aren't going to have a reset on their mortgages until 2027 or 2028 or 2029, depending on when they did it, and how long they did it for. And so until people start worrying about where they're going to sleep at night or put food on the table, you're going to continue to have a participation rate where it doesn't work. And kids, by the way, seem happy to sleep in their parents' bedrooms or their parents' basements, which strikes me as a nightmare. But what do I know?
I want to ask you a question, Nick, about someone who's just getting into this investment scheme, a novice investor. We have ETF funds, index funds, mutual funds. What would you advise them to do?
I would buy the S&P index and the NASDAQ index, and I wouldn't touch anything else.
That's simple.
It's that. Oh, yeah. First of all, if you go look at hedge funds, for example, they're just compensation schemes. Nobody beats the index over time, and then the problem is if you're any short-term investing, like you get beaten up by taxes, right? So the thing that you really want to do is you get a position in the S&P, right, and or the NASDAQ, whatever you think. And by the way, it pays dividends. You reinvest the dividends. Trying to beat the market is a fool's errand, not because you can't do it. And by the way, maybe you get like really passionate about one stock, you see something, and you do that. But other than that, like the taxes associated with any trades you make makes it impossible.
So it's like a form of Las Vegas in a sense.
No. I mean, look, Las Vegas, if you stay at Las Vegas playing at the tables forever, you will lose money. If you invest in the U.S. economy, which is essentially the S&P index or the Nasdaq, the diamonds, you'll make money over an extended period of time. So it's not quite the same thing. If you decide that you're going to be a day trader and you're trading in and out of stocks, that's more Vegas. But the taxes make it impossible, right?
I want to ask you another question, Nick.
And by the way, in size, I will tell you that really, if what the pros will do, right, is they'll buy an index. The index will appreciate, and then they'll borrow against their position in the index. Just like you can take a mortgage on your house, you can borrow money, you can borrow margin against your index position, and then you actually never sell your original position. You just borrow against it. And then, by the way, when you die, in terms of estate taxes, the basis gets reset when you give it to your kids.
You have any assessment on this real estate market right now, Nick? You have any opinions on what people would consider to do, not do? You just spoke about the fact that the interest rates have gone up, which makes it less attractive. Although these interest rates, comparatively speaking to the past, are still very, very low. I mean, they're still fairly reasonable. But what's your take on this real estate market? Where do you think it's going to go, if you have an opinion?
I think all real estate is local, but I think if you've been to San Francisco recently, or Los Angeles and see Tent City, or the crime going up in New York, like what you're going to see is a giant sucking sound out of New York and California, and you're going to see Texas and Florida do great because they're safer and you don't pay income taxes.
I think there's another discussion. They are safer. There is certainly tax advantages, and I don't say this with any political attachment, they are much more intelligently managed also. They have not abandoned the consequence and accountability issues that are lacking in our major cities across the country. That's just resonating across the country, Nick. I want to ask you another question. It's not directly related to finance. We're going to take a quick break, though, and then I'm going to pose that question to Nick. Nick is, part of the generation of Americans that I'm gravely concerned about because I happen to know how old he is. I mean, he could be here another 50 years easy, another 50 years of this crazy. Stick with us, guys. I want to come right back to you. We're back, ladies and gentlemen, and gentlemen who returned to us today again for the second time. We hope to have him back again because of how intelligently and simply he speaks to the economy and issues attached to it, whether it's your investments, real estate. He has very interesting insight and perceptions. He's very well traveled, especially since he's not too far down the road demographically, chronologically, that is. He's part of that demographic that motivated me to take on this podcast and even go to a broader platform, which we're attempting to do right now under the leadership of Brian Williams. I'm concerned about his future. He's got another 50 years here if he just takes care of himself a little better. I'm going to ask Nick a question now that has nothing to do with finance, which I gather you guys have all figured out. He's got the brain. I want to ask you a question, Nick, about your perception of our borders. What do you think about the way the borders are being managed? You have skin in the game. You've got a long time you're going to be here, Nick.
I mean, look, I think it's clearly a complete joke. The answer is also clearly not walls. I think the statistics on the number of people that come in here through airplanes dwarfs whatever is happening, coming across Mexico. I think we should do a much better job of managing the borders. But I also think that there's two things there, right? One is we need to have an intelligent immigration policy. And we don't have that. And look, it used to be that the United States was winning because there was access to capital here. And I'll tell you, fundamentally, I still believe the United States is the greatest country on this planet. And it's really for one reason, which is America recognizes talent better than any other country in the world. If you are talented, you can succeed in this country. That is not true in almost any other country in the world. And so for us, for America to be competitive over the next 100 years, we need to desperately attract people that are smart, because this is going to end up being literally a game of, can we attract the best and the brightest to America over the next 100 years? And I will tell you, one of the things that I've wondered about for years in terms of that side of the equation is, why don't we make it easier if you're super bright to come to America, but say, hey, for the first 10 years, you don't get a choice about which state you get to live in. Like, you can come, we'll let you in, but you're living in Detroit, you're living in New Orleans, you're living in Camden, New Jersey. And why don't we tell Google and Apple and Facebook that, hey, we'll actually give you a lot more like highly specialized, qualified people visas, but you got to open up like in cities that need you. You can't just have this massive brain drain going to kind of Palo Alto, or even, by the way, even if it was Florida and Texas, right? You know, one of the interesting things to me is, if you look at Elon Musk and Tesla, right? They move a factory to Texas. But the only way Tesla makes money is by US government credits, right? Teslas are effectively sold at a loss, and then they get a credit for every car they sell, and they sell those credits to Ford. So why doesn't the federal government give that guy a choice, where they essentially say, hey, if you want to keep getting these credits, by the way, you got to put the factory in West Virginia. And because that's actually a power that the federal government has, right? Like, they don't have to do that. And so kind of similarly, if you look at immigration, I would go with, there are places, I think that immigration should be solved by the federal government on a local basis. I think we clearly need more workers. I'm not totally against a worker visa program. What we can't do, however, right, is add to the entitlement burden that we've already created. And so I'm all for Social Security, I'm all for Medicare, but what you can't do is, you know, you can't bring in somebody that's going to contribute X to the economy, and the entitlements they get is X plus whatever, even 1% or 10%. I think generally, you know, it used to be, I never understood this, right? You get a notice from the Social Security Administration every year saying, this is how much you paid in, this is how much you get back, have a nice day. And for the life of me, I don't understand why we don't say to people, hey, this is how much you've contributed in federal taxes to the government, or, by the way, state taxes to your state. And this is how much you've taken out. We know how much you drive on roads. We know how much you, on federal roads versus local roads. We know how much you used the federally funded, whatever, emergency room or public schools. And say to people, look, your goal should be, look, we understand that some people are going to be, you know, born sick at birth. We understand that some people are going to run into unfortunate circumstances. We understand that, like, you know, you might have fought for a military and no longer able to work, but we can calculate all that. So why don't we say to people, hey, along with here's your numbers around Social Security, here's how much you've contributed, and here's how much you've taken out. And the goal everybody should be in the green, right? Your goal should be to contribute more than you take. And if we thought about it that way, and we thought about immigration that way, which is, are people that we let in going to contribute more than they take, then the answer is probably, yeah, let them in. And if it's going to be that they take more than they give, no way. Excuse my language.
That's okay. We'll edit that. Don't worry about it.
Great.
But, you know, Nick, I want to say one thing. I agree 100% with your assessment of what America is about. And I say it a little different. I say if you have a work ethic and an aptitude in this country, you can't starve. You know, it's just an incredible place for opportunity. Unfortunately, this whole immigration issue has been muddled in our political agenda. Nick, we're going to have to wrap today. I cannot thank you enough for coming on. this has just been so much knowledge and so much insight provided by you. I hope the listeners, if you need to listen to this twice, I suggest you do so, because what you were just dealt is an immense amount of insight as to the economy, investments, cryptocurrency, the potential of the country, even the immigrant, which is an essential part of the continuance of the country, especially for the workforce. We've had immigration attorneys on, one in particular, Edward Herman, who has facilitated access to the country in a proper manner. Nick also pointed out something very interesting. The immigration issue has to do with a lot of people that come here and don't leave. They're making you think it's just a border issue. The border issue is an important part of the discussion, but it's not the entire discussion. Now we're suddenly discussing the northern border, which is interesting. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Nick, I want to make sure you come back. I know that you're incredibly busy. I trace and track you all over the planet as you globetrot. I thank you for so much time you've afforded us today, and I hope we get you back again. Guys, this has been Between the Lines. You can contact us through betweenthelines.tv. I encourage you to become part of this conversation. We're not looking to bang heads. We're not looking to argue, make accusation. We're looking to learn and grow. We want to ensure the future of our young people here. This is not about contention. You don't have to be like-minded. We need to start to reintroduce civility and decency into our conversations. If you listen to this conversation today, there was a lot of decency, a lot of civility, and a lot of information. And I have to say, proudly, he is my friend, even though he talks over my head sometimes. In any case, we'll see you guys next week. Nick, thank you so much, buddy. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you. Take care.
You too, Nick. Thanks, buddy.